Have you ever had that unsettling feeling of sensing something about a person, an environment, or a situation, only to find out much later that what you felt was right? As if there were some kind of silent radar inside you picking up things that no one around you seems to notice. An almost imperceptible shift in someone's tone of voice. A look that doesn't match the words being spoken. A strange tension in the room that everyone else ignores. A hidden intention behind an ordinary smile. And the most disturbing part is that, almost every time, you try to rationalize it. You try to convince yourself that you're imagining things. That you're being too sensitive. That maybe you're analyzing things more than necessary. But deep down, some part of you keeps seeing. Keeps sensing. Keeps registering details that go completely unnoticed by most people. And that can be exhausting. Because seeing what no one else notices doesn't immediately make you feel powerful. Most of the time, it makes you feel out of place. As if you're always one step ahead of situations that everyone else is still moving through on autopilot. You notice patterns before they repeat. You catch inconsistencies before they become a problem. You sense emotional shifts before someone even admits what they're feeling. And because you can't explain exactly how you know, you begin to doubt your own perception. Is this intuition? Is this overthinking? Is this anxiety? Or is there something deeper happening in the way you perceive reality? Carl Jung used to say that what is hidden in the unconscious often reveals itself through subtle signals to those who have learned, consciously or unconsciously, to observe beyond the surface. And maybe that is exactly what is happening to you. Maybe you're not imagining too much. Maybe you've developed a kind of perception that most people simply haven't trained. Because the truth is, most people live reacting only to what is explicit. To what is said. To what is shown. To what is obvious. But a few people begin to pick up on what is implicit. What goes unsaid. What is poorly disguised. The repeated pattern. The emotional energy hidden behind ordinary interactions. And when that happens, social life changes. Relationships change. The way you walk into a place, observe a conversation, or feel someone's presence changes completely. But there is a price. The more you perceive, the harder it becomes to pretend you didn't see it. And that is where this silent discomfort of feeling different without fully knowing why begins. Because you start noticing that certain conclusions come to you before there is any concrete proof. And that is frightening. But it also awakens a question that is impossible to ignore. What if this isn't your mind exaggerating, but a sign that you are seeing layers of reality that most people simply do not access? Because there are some very specific signs that reveal when a person has developed this kind of rare perception. And the first one usually appears in moments when no one else is paying attention. And before I show you these signs, I want to ask you for one simple thing. If this topic has already stirred something in you within these first few minutes, if at some point you felt that strange sensation of, it feels like they're describing something I live with and have never been able to explain, then leave your like on this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but that's what keeps this kind of content reaching people who also feel out of place because they perceive too much and can't find answers on the surface. And I want to make you an even more important invitation. Comment down below, I perceive, if you've ever had this feeling of picking up on things that no one around you seem to notice. Because when you write that, you're not just interacting with the video, you're recognizing something inside yourself that may have spent years being ignored or dismissed. And if you enjoy content that dives into these deeper layers of the mind, human behavior, perception, individuation, and the ideas of Carl Jung, subscribe to the channel now. Because the next few minutes may help you understand why certain things have always seemed so obvious to you, and completely invisible to everyone else. And the first sign that your mind picks up what no one else notices begins in such a subtle way, that most people have no idea what's happening. The first sign that you see things no one else notices does not show up in major events or dramatic situations. It appears precisely in the most ordinary moments, and that's why almost no one takes it seriously when it starts happening. You walk into a room and feel that something is off. Even when everything appears normal. People are talking. No one has said anything unusual. Nothing is visibly out of place. But inside you, a tension arises that is hard to explain. As if the air were charged with something invisible. As if there were a silent discomfort moving through that space and only you were picking it up. And the curious part is that this doesn't happen once or twice. It happens repeatedly. You meet someone and, even before that person shows any concrete behavior, some part of you already sounds an alarm. Not because they said something wrong. Not because they did anything clearly suspicious. But because tiny details, almost imperceptible ones, begin to form an internal impression. A microsecond of hesitation before answering. A smile that never reaches the eyes. An excessively calculated friendliness. An emotional energy that doesn't line up with the words. And you feel it. You feel it without being able to prove it. You feel it before you understand it. You feel it before you can even rationally organize why it bothers you. It's as if your mind is registering signals that haven't yet reached the conscious level. And this is where many people begin to sabotage themselves. Because there is no concrete proof, you tend to invalidate your own perception. You think, I must be imagining it. Maybe I'm being too suspicious. It doesn't make sense to jump to conclusions this early. So you ignore it. You try to act normally. You try to give the benefit of the doubt. But days or weeks later, the situation reveals itself, and what you felt at the beginning makes sense. The person shows exactly the inconsistency you picked up on. The environment reveals exactly the tension you had sensed. The social dynamic confirms exactly the discomfort that had seemed unexplainable. And that starts to unsettle you. Because it stops looking like coincidence. It starts looking like a pattern. And when a pattern repeats too many times, it forces you to look at something you may have spent years trying to ignore. Your perception does not work like most people's. Carl Jung spoke about how the human psyche communicates through symbols, subtle signals, and contents that do not always arrive through logic first. They often arrive through sensation, intuition, through an unconscious reading of the environment. And some people, without realizing it, develop a much stronger sensitivity for capturing these contents. In other words, before your mind forms a conclusion, your internal system has already read dozens of microinformations. Minimal expressions. Shifts in energy. Inconsistencies between speech and emotion. Small breaks in pattern. And all of that gathers inside you as a strong impression. That's why you feel before you know. It's not magic. It's not paranoia. It's subconscious perception highly trained by observation. But living this way comes with a price. Because seeing these kinds of things makes you feel constantly out of sync. While everyone else is relaxed, you are alert. While everyone else accepts the surface, you see the cracks. While others walk into certain situations without questioning, some part of you is already analyzing the invisible. And that is exhausting. Exhausting because you can't simply switch it off. You can't walk into places without picking up the emotional atmosphere. You can't hear certain statements without sensing the intention behind them. You can't ignore when something feels misaligned. And the worst part, because other people don't perceive the same things, you begin to think the problem is you. That you are too intense. That you think too much. That you feel too much. But maybe what is happening is the opposite. Maybe you perceive too much to be able to live on the surface the way most people do. And that is the first sign, your mind picks up atmospheres, intentions, and micro-inconsistencies before they become visible. But that leads us to an even more uncomfortable question. Because sensing the environment is one thing. Now, when that same reading starts happening inside people themselves, even while they are smiling and saying everything is fine, the effect becomes far more disturbing. If this part spoke to you, comment something simple like, "I feel it first," or "I pick up the atmosphere." That even helps other people realize they're not the only ones living through this. And when this reading stops happening only with environments and starts happening with people, everything becomes even more confusing. Because we are not talking about reading minds. We are talking about sensing fractures. You look at someone smiling, talking normally, acting sociable, and still feel that something is off. Not in the words, but between the words and the emotion. As if the words are moving in one direction, and the person's inner energy is moving in a completely different one. It's that feeling of hearing, "I'm fine," and immediately sensing that they are not. Or hearing a compliment and feeling, behind it, a subtle edge of competition. Or receiving kindness and noticing a hidden agenda that no one else seems to catch. And that is extremely disturbing because, once again, there is no concrete proof at first. There is only a perception. A strong internal impression. A kind of silent reading that happens before logic. And that is where the doubt begins. Because you ask yourself if you are judging too much. If you are being suspicious for no reason. If you are creating stories in your head. After all, externally, everything looks normal. People smile. People say the right words. People maintain the expected social posture. So why do you keep feeling that something does not fit? That is the part that makes many people distrust their own intuition for years. Because the world teaches you to trust what is explicit. What was said. What was shown. What can be immediately verified. But it rarely teaches you to trust what is perceived between the lines. And yet, those are exactly the lines your mind keeps reading. Carl Jung said that human beings are constantly expressing unconscious contents even when they try to control them socially. The voice gives it away. The eyes give it away. The timing of the response gives it away. The body gives it away. Small cracks in the social mask let hidden things slip out. Most people do not notice these cracks because they are listening to the speech. But some people notice because they are reading the whole picture. And maybe that is your case. You do not just hear what the person says. You hear what they avoid saying. You do not just observe the behavior. You observe the misalignment between behavior and emotion. You do not just register presence. You register intention. And that completely changes the way you live relationships. Because while other people are still forming an opinion about someone, you are already sensing whether there is sincerity, insecurity, manipulation, neediness, falseness, or tension. But this ability does not come with comfort. It comes with a difficult problem. It is almost impossible to explain. How do you tell someone you do not trust a person because you felt an inconsistency? How do you explain that you sensed a hidden agenda without any objective evidence? How do you justify distancing yourself based on details so subtle? Most of the time, you do not justify it. You simply keep it to yourself. You observe in silence. You wait for time to confirm it. And many times, it does. That is what starts to scramble your mind. Because the more your perceptions prove accurate, the more you realize that you are seeing signals that go unnoticed by almost everyone. And that creates a strange kind of isolation. Not necessarily physical, but mental. You find yourself surrounded by people and, still, feeling like you are seeing a layer they are not seeing. As if there were a second level of reading happening inside you all the time. A tiring level. An invisible level. A level that prevents you from simply accepting relationships at face value. And here the most uncomfortable question of all begins to emerge. If you pick up on so many hidden intentions, so many emotional inconsistencies, and so many subtle patterns, why exactly did your mind develop this unusual perception? Because this may not be just sensitivity. It may be the result of something much deeper within your psychological structure. If this makes sense to you, comment something like, "I read beyond," or "I feel the intention." Sometimes putting it into words is the first time a person realizes this ability has a name. And this is exactly where most people get everything wrong. Because when you perceive more than others, common sense tries to convince you that it's overthinking, anxiety, distrust, or exaggerated sensitivity. But, what if it isn't? What if this unusual perception is not a flaw in your mind, but a different stage of consciousness? Carl Jung developed a powerful idea around this when he spoke about individuation, the process in which a person begins to move out of automatic collective behavior and starts developing a more conscious relationship with their own psyche and with the world around them. Put simply, while most people react to what is visible, some begin to perceive what lies underneath. And this happens because the mind stops operating only on the rational surface. It begins to integrate unconscious signals, emotional patterns, behavioral contradictions, symbolic movements, shifts in relational energy. You stop seeing only isolated facts, and begin seeing systems. That is the great turning point. Because an ordinary person sees a conversation, you see the hidden tension inside it. An ordinary person sees a smile. You see whether that smile came from spontaneity, a need for approval, falseness, or discomfort. An ordinary person hears a sentence. You hear the emotion the sentence is trying to cover. And this is not mysticism. It is deep reading of human patterns. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious manifests itself all the time, even when consciousness tries to maintain an organized appearance. That is why what a person hides often leaks through the smallest details. And when your mind is trained, often by life experiences, observation, or emotional hypervigilance, it begins to catch these leaks with impressive speed. In other words, you are not necessarily guessing. You are connecting microinformation that most people ignore. Your brain combines expression, pause, contradiction, tone, rhythm, posture, environment, context, and turns all of that into sensation. That is why perception arrives as intuition. But behind intuition there is processing. There is reading. There is expanded awareness. And maybe that is why you have felt so out of place for so long. Because while many people can live just fine accepting things as they seem to be, you cannot avoid the silent question. What is really happening here? And that question changes everything. It changes your relationships. It changes your trust in people. It changes the way you walk into environments. It even changes your tolerance for superficiality. Because once you begin to see the hidden layers, the surface stops being enough. But that also puts you in conflict. Because perceiving too much means becoming disappointed more quickly. You notice the inconsistency before the mask falls. You notice the intention before the gesture repeats. You notice the falseness before the public evidence appears. And that makes you more reserved, more observant, more silent. Not because you dislike people, but because your mind is already reading long before the conversation truly begins. It is as if you are always several emotional steps ahead. And that produces a fatigue that is hard to explain. Because simple interactions stop being simple when you can see invisible layers in every detail. But here comes the most important part. This perception does not appear out of nowhere. It usually develops in people who were forced, at some point in life, to observe more than they could trust. People who learn to read the atmosphere before relaxing. To read intention before opening up. To read signs before believing. In other words, your awareness may have been refined by experiences that taught you to see what was never said. And that takes us to an even deeper point. Because if this ability was built that way, then there is a third sign, perhaps the strongest of all, that shows when you not only perceive more, but can no longer live on autopilot the way most people do. If this part stirred something in you, comment something like, "I see the layers," or "Nothing feels superficial to me." It reinforces something important: more people are living this silent perception than it seems. And this may be the point where everything stops feeling like just an unusual sensitivity, and starts becoming a permanent condition in the way you exist in the world. Because noticing invisible things once in a while is an experience. But no longer being able to switch that perception off is a transformation. The third movement begins when you notice that you can no longer participate in situations with the same naivety as other people. You enter conversations, but part of you keeps observing. You meet people, but part of you keeps analyzing. You listen to stories, but part of you keeps connecting signals. It is as if your mind is never entirely only in the present moment of the interaction. It is also behind the interaction. Reading the subtext. Reading the emotion. Reading the invisible structure. And that completely changes your social experience. Because while many are still only reacting to what they receive, you are already trying to understand what generated it. What is the motivation? What is the intention? What is the repeated pattern? What is the hidden contradiction? You no longer consume events in a pure way. You decode them. And that is one of the strongest signs that your consciousness has moved beyond autopilot. Carl Jung said that the expansion of consciousness comes at a cost: it breaks unconscious participation in the collective. In other words, when you begin seeing too much, it becomes difficult to simply be carried along by the surface the way most people are. You stop living only inside experiences. You begin observing them from outside as well. And that gives you a perceptive advantage, but takes away a certain emotional innocence. Because now almost everything seems to have layers. A friendship seems to carry hidden unmet needs. A casual conversation seems to carry subtle validation games. A compliment seems to carry a need for approval or comparison. A distancing seems to reveal fears that no one verbalizes. You see the machinery behind the gesture. And once the machinery appears, the gesture alone no longer convinces you. That is why so many people with this kind of perception begin to feel an internal distancing from the world. Not because they hate human interaction, but because interaction becomes mentally dense, exhausting, full of unspoken information. You go to a gathering and leave drained not because of what happened externally, but because of everything you silently picked up. The microtensions, the masked insecurities, the subtle power struggles, the misaligned intentions. It is too much information. Too much reading. And the curious part is that almost no one understands this exhaustion. Because for everyone else it was just a conversation. For you it was a room full of unconscious signals. And this creates a very specific sensation, that of being surrounded and, at the same time, mentally alone. As if you were participating in a film whose hidden script only you are reading. That feeling can make you think you have become cold, distant, or antisocial. But that is not always the case. Sometimes, you are simply saturated from perceiving. Saturated from decoding. Saturated from never being able to simply consume the surface without seeing the cracks. And here comes the strongest shift in this topic. This does not mean you are socially broken. It means your mind has begun operating in a state of continuous awareness. You no longer walk into environments unguarded. You no longer receive words without analysis. You no longer accept behaviors without reading them. Your system is always searching for the invisible. And that state gives you a silent power. You are rarely caught completely by surprise. But it also charges a high price, the difficulty of relaxing inside the human experience. Because those who see too much, rarely get to simply live. And maybe that is exactly why the next sign is so uncomfortable. Because it is not enough to perceive what is hidden in others and in the environment. There comes a moment when you begin to perceive patterns even inside yourself, and that irreversibly changes your relationship with your own mind. If this made sense, comment something like, "I never switch off," or "My mind reads everything." Some people will recognize themselves in that more than they imagine. And when that perception finally turns inward, it is as if the psychological ground shifts beneath you. Because until now you were looking at the environment, at people, at hidden intentions, at invisible dynamics. But there comes a moment when the same mind that reads the world begins to read itself with the same intensity. And that is disorienting. Because you begin to notice internal patterns that most people move through without ever seeing. You notice when you are about to repeat a behavior before you even do it. You notice when an emotion was not born in the present, but was triggered by an old memory. You notice when you are seeking approval, withdrawing, distrusting, or creating distance, and you see the machinery before the act fully takes shape. It is as if there is an observer inside you observing the observer. A layer of almost permanent self-awareness. And that, while it brings clarity, also brings weight. Because now you can no longer simply feel without analyzing the feeling. You can no longer react without sensing the origin of the reaction. You can no longer enter certain patterns without noticing that you are entering them. You begin watching yourself from within. Carl Jung said that the process of individuation requires confrontation with one's own shadow, that is, with everything hidden inside us that still influences thoughts, choices, and attachments. But when that shadow starts becoming visible, inner life never feels simple again. Because you begin to notice your contradictions. The part of you that wants closeness, and the part of you that pulls away. The part of you that longs to be understood, and the part of you that hides everything. The part of you that wants to trust, and the part of you that scans for danger in every detail. You see the internal battle happening in real time. And this is one of the rarest signs of all. You do not only perceive the invisible outside of you, you perceive the invisible within. But that does not immediately turn you into someone who has it all figured out. In fact, many times it turns you into someone even more restless. Because awareness does not mean automatic peace. It means seeing. And seeing can be exhausting. You notice the mechanisms of your own neediness. You notice old wounds interfering with the present. You notice when you are trying to control situations to avoid pain. You even notice when you are pretending to yourself that something did not affect you. Your mind exposes you to yourself. And that creates a very intense relationship with silence. Because in silence, you see more. Without distraction, the patterns get louder. The questions get louder. The memories get louder. The internal inconsistencies get louder. That is why many people with this level of perception swing between two states, a deep desire to understand themselves, and a deep exhaustion from never being able to switch off their own awareness. You want answers, but sometimes you feel suffocated by so many readings. You want clarity, but clarity reveals difficult things. You want to know yourself, but self-knowledge tears away masks that once felt comfortable. And then a powerful realization emerges. Maybe your difference is not only in perceiving others. Maybe it is in living permanently in a state of observation. External observation. Internal observation. Emotional observation. Symbolic observation. As if your mind had been trained to search for what lies behind everything. And that explains why shallow conversations drain you. Why highly predictable people bore you. Why artificial environments bother you. Why emotional lies almost jump into your eyes. You can no longer live only in the visible. Because the invisible has become too loud. But there is one question that may be the most important of all. Is this rare perception only a mental burden, or is there a way to turn this excess awareness into psychological power? If this part touched something inside you, comment something like, "I observe myself all the time," or "My mind is never silent." Many people will understand exactly what that means without needing any further explanation. And this is the part where almost no one tells you the truth. Because for a long time, you may have believed that perceiving too much was only a burden. Too much analysis. A tired mind. A difficulty relaxing. A feeling of not belonging. But there is a radical shift when you understand that expanded awareness is not only suffering, it is raw material for power. The problem is that before it becomes power, it feels like confusion. Because sharp perception without direction creates overload. You see contradictions and it wears you down. You see intentions and it distances you. You see internal patterns and it unsettles you. But when that same perception finds understanding, it becomes a strategic advantage. This is where many people wake up late. Your mind was not built only to notice the invisible. It was built to anticipate. Anticipate behavior. Anticipate emotional exhaustion. Anticipate manipulation. Anticipate repeated emotional cycles. Anticipate psychological traps. While some people walk into cycles without realizing it, you can identify the machinery before the cycle closes. And that completely changes your position in life. You stop being merely someone sensitive to the environment. You become someone difficult to fool with appearances. Carl Jung argued that making conscious what was once unconscious is what prevents a person from being blindly governed by their own patterns. There is a quote attributed to him that summarizes this brutally: "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Do you see how deep that is? Most people call it fate when, in reality, it is unconscious repetition. They choose the same dynamics. Trust the same profiles. Fall into the same emotional games. React with the same mechanisms. But those who see the pattern beforehand, begin to interrupt fate. And that is real psychological power. Because you begin choosing with more precision. You choose where to step in. You choose where not to insist. You choose when to stay silent. You choose when to walk away before the damage. You choose when not to give energy to those who only wanted access. Your perception stops being passive and becomes a filter. A fine filter. An almost surgical filter. You no longer need to wait for disappointment to become explicit before acting. You no longer need to wait for the environment to contaminate you before leaving. You no longer need to wait for emotional repetition to destroy you before recognizing it. You read early. And those who read early suffer less later. That is the transformation. What once looked like paranoia begins to reveal structure. What looked like oversensitivity reveals adaptive intelligence. What looked like estrangement reveals selective awareness. You stop apologizing for perceiving. You stop trying to convince yourself that, maybe I'm imagining it. Because most of the time, you were not imagining it. You were sensing it ahead of time. And that gives back something you may have lost at some point: trust in your own reading. Trust in your own discomfort. Trust in your own intuition. Trust in that uneasiness that appeared without concrete proof, but later made perfect sense. A mind that perceives invisible signals cannot be trained to invalidate itself all the time. Because when you invalidate yourself, you hand over your radar. And whoever hands over their own radar goes back to living exposed to what they had already learned to detect. That is why the real insight is not, how do I stop perceiving too much? The right question is, how do I use this perception to live with more clarity, more protection, and more emotional command? Because there is a huge difference between carrying a gift without understanding it and carrying a gift knowing how to operate it. In the first case, it suffocates you. In the second, it positions you above many of the games that once captured you. And maybe this is where everything becomes even more intense. Because when you learn to turn perception into power, you inevitably begin to notice an uncomfortable distance between you and most people. If this lit something up inside you, comment, "My perception is my filter," or "I don't ignore my signals anymore." That helps anchor this shift in awareness. If you made it this far, it's because at some point in this video you felt like you weren't just hearing words, you were hearing yourself from the inside. And when that happens, it isn't entertainment. It's recognition. Maybe you spent years thinking you perceived too much, thought too much, analyzed too much, when in reality, you were simply seeing layers that many people still haven't learned to notice. So do one thing, don't let this awareness die here. If this kind of message speaks to a part of you that almost no one understands, subscribe to the channel now. Because the next videos are for people who can no longer go back to living on autopilot. People who are awakening. People who are seeing. People who are learning to turn perception into mental strength. And I want to know whether this message reflected exactly what you feel in silence. Comment down below, "I see beyond," or write in your own words what this video awakened in you. I always read the comments, and many times, that is where you realize there are other minds living through the same process as yours. Leave your like, because that helps YouTube deliver this message to more people who are feeling strange, out of place, or mentally overloaded without understanding why. And share this video with someone who needs to hear this, someone who may be starting to perceive the world in a way no one around them can explain. And don't stop here. The next video will show you why people with high mental perception tend to drift further and further away from the majority, and what that reveals about their level of consciousness. Watch it, because after that, many things will begin to make even more sense. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next video.